My name is Elias Harper, and I am a ranger at Banff National Park in Canada. I chose this life because I have always felt more connected to the trees and the whisper of the wind through the mountains than to the hustle and bustle of the cities. My days are spent on trails covered in pines, tracking animals, and occasionally encountering tourists who seek to lose themselves in the vastness of nature. It was early morning, just as the first rays of sunlight pierced the thick fog that clung to the trees. I was patrolling one of the less traveled paths in the park when I saw it. A majestic deer, motionless in the clearing ahead. From a distance, it looked almost like a painting. Its antlers were imposing, and its coat seemed to glow in the faint light of dawn. But something was off. As I approached, I noticed small details that didn't add up. Its neck had a strange greenish hue, and on its right flank, there were dark marks, as if the skin was beginning to decay. The deer didn't react to my presence. Its eyes, dull and lifeless, reflected an unsettling calm, as if the creature were trapped between life and death. I stopped a few meters away, my ranger instincts on high alert. This wasn't normal. The air around the animal felt colder, as if it carried a warning I couldn't ignore. The days following the strange encounter with the deer passed with a lingering unease I couldn't shake. The image of its decaying coat and those empty eyes haunted me even in broad daylight. As a ranger, I've seen sick, injured, and even dead animals. But this was different, as if that creature was whispering something to me that I couldn't understand. That night, I was in my cabin, exhausted after a long day. Outside, the night breeze rustled the branches, a sound I usually found comforting. But as I settled into bed, I heard something that made me freeze. It was a low, guttural moan, like that of an animal in pain. I got up and walked to the window. The forest, shrouded in shadows, seemed calm, but the sound persisted, clearer now. It seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby, a lament that blended with the darkness, filled with a pain that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, feeling the cold air against my face. I took a couple of steps toward the forest, shining the light on the trees that loomed like ghostly figures. "Is anyone there?" I asked, though I didn't expect an answer. The feeling that something was out of place washed over me again, as if I weren't alone, but also not accompanied. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving me in a silence that felt more unsettling than the moan. I slowly backed toward the cabin, every muscle tense. Just before closing the door, I heard something that made me freeze. Light footsteps, accompanied by a slow crunching, as if something heavy was moving through the fallen leaves. I turned toward the darkness and turned on the flashlight. There, among the trees, I could make out a familiar silhouette. It was the deer. Its eyes, those lifeless eyes, now seemed to be watching me. But it didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me from the shadows. I quickly closed the door and locked it, though I knew there was no physical danger. Something else was happening. That creature couldn't have come here, or could it? Outside, the forest fell silent again. But in my mind, the echo of the moan lingered, like a warning or a plea I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I woke up with my body tense and my mind filled with unease. The events of the previous night still weighed on me, and I decided I couldn't ignore them any longer. Equipped with my radio, a camera, and a tranquilizer rifle just in case, I ventured into the forest, determined to find the deer or some explanation for what was happening. The trail was covered in a light layer of frost, and the morning air had a strange weight to it, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As I made my way to the clearing where I had first seen it, I began to notice something disturbing. There were marks on the trees and the ground, deep grooves, as if something with enormous claws had torn through the bark and scratched the earth. But these marks were unlike any tracks I knew. They weren't from a bear, a cougar, or any common animal in the area. They were larger, more erratic, and some were accompanied by a dark, sticky substance I didn't dare touch. I followed the marks, which seemed to spread in a chaotic pattern, as if something had wandered aimlessly or had been chasing something else. However, I found no clear footprints, which was even more disconcerting. Only those grooves and strange trails, which led me deeper into the forest. Every time I stopped to observe, I felt as if I were being watched. I looked around, but all I saw were motionless trees and shadows that seemed to dance with the wind. The feeling was so intense that my breathing quickened, and every sound, a branch cracking, a crow flapping its wings, seemed amplified. In the days that followed, I kept searching. I patrolled the areas near the clearing and checked the trail cameras we had installed in the park. But I found nothing. No deer, no more marks, not even traces of the strange substance. It was as if everything I had seen had been ripped from the landscape, erased with unsettling precision. My frustration grew. Every night I returned to the cabin with more questions than answers, and the images of the deer and the marks continued to haunt me. Sometimes, I woke up in the middle of the night convinced I had heard those moans again, but when I went out into the forest, I found only silence. The other rangers noticed my change, but I didn't know how to explain what was happening without sounding crazy. Something was going on in that forest, something that seemed to defy all logic, and with each passing day, the sense of danger grew more tangible. On the 5th day, while checking an area near the river, I found something that chilled me to the bone. A group of deer, dead, their bodies covered in the same signs of decay I had seen on the first one. But this was worse. There were signs of a struggle, broken branches, disturbed earth, blood on the ground. It seemed as if something had attacked them, something that left no clear tracks, only destruction and a terrifying silence that spread like a blanket over the area. That afternoon, after the gruesome discovery of the dead deer, I decided to keep exploring, despite the knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. There was something I needed to see, something I felt was waiting for me further ahead, even though my instincts screamed at me to turn back. The sun was about to set when I found it. In a clearing at the edge of a ravine, surrounded by twisted trees, was the deer, or what was left of it. Its figure was no longer majestic. It had grown unnaturally, its antlers stretching in impossible directions, like deformed roots reaching into the air. Its body, in an advanced state of decay, looked bloated and grotesque. But the most terrifying part was the new limbs, enormous claws, resembling those of a predator, protruding from its torso at awkward angles. Its neck twisted unnaturally, and its jaw seemed split, emitting a sound between a howl and a growl that echoed in the forest silence. The deer, or what it once was, didn't move toward me. Instead, it seemed trapped in an endless cycle of pain. Its eyes, which once seemed empty, now glowed with a terrifying intensity, as if something else was staring out from within. Suddenly, it turned toward a massive tree, an ancient fir that dominated the clearing, and began to slam its body against the trunk with desperate violence. Each impact echoed through the air like a macabre drum. I stood frozen, unable to look away, as the grotesque creature repeated the act over and over. With each strike, chunks of its putrid flesh fell to the ground, filling the air with an unbearable stench. Finally, with one last impact that shook even the tree's trunk, the deer collapsed. What remained on the ground was a heap of unrecognizable flesh, still faintly steaming in the cold night. The forest fell into an overwhelming silence, as if every living thing was holding its breath. I stood there, trembling, my flashlight shaking in my hand, staring at the pile of remains before me. A momentary sense of relief was quickly replaced by a deeper fear. What was that? Where had it come from? And most terrifying of all, was it truly dead? I took a step back, feeling that if I stayed any longer, that place, or whatever inhabited it, might claim me too. I carried away a disturbing memory. The wind, once calm, now seemed to whisper unintelligible words, as if the forest was speaking or warning me. I knew I would never see the world the same way again. That night, as I returned to my cabin under a heavy sky of barely twinkling stars, a sense of smallness washed over me. The forest, the same one I had walked for years as if it were my home, now stood as something unknown, hostile, and full of secrets I could never comprehend. I had spent my life on its trails, learning to read its signs and respecting its cycles. But what I had witnessed in that clearing was beyond anything my experience or logic could explain. I sat by the fire in the cabin, the crackling of the wood seeming louder than usual, and I reflected. Perhaps I had made the mistake of assuming the forest was something entirely decipherable, that everything within its bounds could be explained by science or experience. But that night I learned something different. There are things in this world, forces, entities, perhaps ancient and forgotten natures, that exist beyond our understanding. And maybe it's not our place to unravel them. I didn't share what I saw that afternoon with anyone. When tourists ask me about the mysteries of the forest, I give them the reassuring answers they expect. But deep down, I know that beneath that layer of normalcy lies a world we don't understand. A world where time doesn't flow the same, where life and death intertwine in ways that defy our beliefs. In the end, my duty as a ranger didn't change. I still patrol the trails, care for the wildlife, and guide those who venture into this place. But now I do so with a renewed sense of humility and respect. The forest is much more than an ecosystem or a landscape. It is something alive, something immense, and its true nature is beyond my understanding. Perhaps the deer, or whatever it had become, was a warning. Or maybe it was just a fleeting glimpse into a world I was never meant to see. But it doesn't matter. I've accepted that I don't have all the answers and that, in some cases, the best I can do is move forward, trusting that the forest will remain both a mystery and a refuge. Next story. My name is Viktor Kovac, and I am a ranger in the vast, silent forests of the Carpathians in Slovakia. I've dedicated nearly a decade to this job, patrolling the dense trails under a sky that often feels closer than anywhere else. The routine of my days is as constant as the whisper of the wind through the pines, monitoring wildlife, recording any changes in the environment, and occasionally guiding a lost hiker back to safety. But that day, everything I thought I knew about the forest changed forever. It was a gray afternoon, the kind of day that makes the forest feel heavier, as if the trees were carrying the weight of the low-hanging clouds. I was walking along a rarely used trail, checking monitoring traps set to study the movement of the region's wolves. The air was cold but not uncomfortable, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a strange reflection among the trees, a trick of light playing with my vision. But no. About 20 meters away in the clearing stood someone. A tall figure, easily over 2 meters, motionless among the tree trunks. Its skin was an unnatural white, as if it had never felt the touch of the sun. It wore no clothes that I could distinguish, and its body was so thin it seemed fragile, but there was something in its posture that radiated an unsettling strength. I wanted to shout at it, ask who it was, but the words caught in my throat. My eyes met its, or at least I thought they did. They were dark, deep, as if they were empty. I blinked, and in that instant, it was gone. The clearing was empty. There was no sound of branches crunching, no whisper of movement. It was as if it had never been there. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I could almost hear it over the silence of the forest. I looked around, searching for some sign that I wasn't losing my sanity, but everything was exactly as before, except for the strange tingling on my skin. That encounter, if it even was one, left me with a feeling I couldn't explain. Something in the forest had changed, or maybe it was me. But since then, every time I patrol the trails, I feel like I'm not alone. That something or someone is watching me from the shadows. From that day on, the forest never felt the same. Even under the clear skies of morning, when the sun cast soft shadows among the trees, I felt an invisible presence, as if something were following me just at the edge of my vision. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds singing, the whisper of the wind, now seemed like a backdrop hiding something deeper, something I couldn't explain. I tried to forget it. I told myself it must have been a hallucination, a trick of a tired mind, or the diffuse light of that afternoon. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more vivid the memory became. The tall, pale figure, motionless, and those eyes, if I had even truly seen them. Weeks passed, and though I continued my work as usual, I couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. My colleagues noticed. "You're distracted, Victor," said Peter, one of the rangers I often patrolled with. "Everything okay?" I nodded, lying because the truth seemed too absurd. How could I explain something I didn't even understand? One particularly cold afternoon, Peter and I were patrolling a remote section of the forest, where the tree canopy was so dense it barely let any light through. The air smelled of damp earth, and the crunch of broken branches under our feet was the only sound breaking the silence. As we checked a damaged trap, that feeling returned. It was as if the forest had held its breath, as if everything had stopped in its natural course. Then I saw it again. It was standing about 30 meters away, in the dim light between two massive pines. Its posture was identical to the first time, upright, almost rigid, with an unnatural stillness that made my stomach twist. Its pale skin stood out like a white flame against the darkness of the forest. "Peter," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the figure. "Do you see that?" Peter looked up from the trap and followed my gaze. "See what?" he asked, confused. "Over there, between the pines, that thing." I didn't finish the sentence because, as soon as Peter turned his head, the figure disappeared. Just like that, without a sound, without a perceptible movement. As if it had never been there. Peter frowned at me. "Victor, there's nothing there. Maybe it's nerves. You haven't been yourself these weeks." His tone was understanding, but I could sense the skepticism behind his words. "No, Peter, I saw it," I insisted, feeling the fear begin to turn into frustration. "It's so pale. It's not human, or at least it doesn't seem to be. It can't be my imagination. I saw it with my own eyes." Peter sighed and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Maybe you need a break, friend. This job can be heavy. The forest plays tricks on our minds if we're not at peace." But it wasn't in my head. I knew it. In the days that followed, every time I mentioned what I had seen, the response was always the same: disbelief. Some colleagues began to avoid me, while others simply joked about it, calling me the forest ghost hunter. The laughter was light, but I could feel the weight of judgment in every glance. The nights were the worst. In the silence of my cabin, I heard noises outside the windows, like soft footsteps on the grass or branches crunching under a light weight. I'd look outside, armed with a flashlight, but there was never anything there. Or at least, nothing I could see. One night, however, the sound was different. It wasn't footsteps, but a dull thud, as if something had hit the wooden wall of the cabin. I got up, my heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight and a hunting knife. I opened the door carefully, expecting to find a lost animal or some wind that had moved something. But there was nothing, except for a trail of footprints in the snow, starting right in front of my door and leading into the forest. The footprints were long and narrow, as if something very tall and light had walked there. My flashlight illuminated the footprints until they vanished among the trees, and there, in the distance, I swore I saw it again. A tall, pale shadow, motionless. And this time, though I couldn't see it clearly, I felt it was smiling. That trail of footprints kept me awake that night. For hours, I lay in bed, the flashlight still in my hand, my eyes fixed on the window, waiting for any sign of movement in the darkness. But nothing happened. Only the oppressive silence of the forest and the rapid beating of my heart kept me company. I tried to convince myself that this was all a product of my exhausted mind. Maybe I'm hallucinating, I thought, though logic didn't comfort me. I closed my eyes tightly and forced myself to rest. The first images of sleep came with difficulty, blurry, as if something were blocking them. Then I heard it. A voice. Chilling and low, like a whisper that echoed in every corner of my mind. It didn't sound human. It was as if every word were made of the creaking of branches and the whisper of the wind. "Thank you," it said, drawing out the words as if savoring each syllable. "Thank you for taking care of our home." I wanted to wake up, but my body was paralyzed. I felt the weight of that voice like a dense fog infiltrating my mind, mingling with my thoughts. "Now, we will return the favor." A muffled scream escaped my throat as I managed to open my eyes. I sat up abruptly, sweating, my breath ragged. The knife was still in my hand, and the flashlight was still on, its light pointing at the cabin ceiling. Outside, the darkness persisted, but this time there were no sounds, not even the usual ones of the nocturnal forest. When dawn finally arrived, I felt relieved, though I was still uneasy. I opened the cabin door to get some fresh air, but what I saw made me step back immediately. In the center of the camp, right where we rangers usually gathered, was a pile of dead deer. A dozen, maybe more. Their bodies were stacked on top of each other, their eyes open and empty, their necks twisted at impossible angles. It was a macabre scene, completely out of place. I approached carefully, covering my nose and mouth from the stench that was beginning to rise. There were no signs of predators. The wounds didn't look like those from wild animals. There was something strange about their bodies, as if they had been drained of life, of strength, and left there as a grotesque offering. "What the hell?" I murmured, but my voice barely broke the silence. When the other rangers arrived at the camp, they were horrified. Their looks of disbelief quickly turned to me, as if I had some answer. But all I could do was shake my head, unable to explain the inexplicable. Peter was the first to speak. "This doesn't make sense, Victor. What happened here?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. When I woke up, they were there. Some wanted to call the forest authorities, while others insisted it was a wolf attack, though we knew wolves didn't act like this. No one could explain what had happened, and I didn't dare mention the voice I had heard in my dream. That night, while the others tried to sleep in the camp, I stayed awake by the fire, my knife in hand, watching the shadows dancing among the trees. I felt that something or someone was watching us, something that didn't belong to this world. In the end, I didn't know whether to be grateful or afraid for my life. "Thank you for taking care of the forest," the voice echoed in my memory, like a whisper that would never fade. Was it a warning? A pact I didn't remember making? As the fire began to die down, a cold breeze brushed my face, and with it came the sound of branches cracking in the distance. I smiled, though it wasn't a smile of relief. The day passed in an eerie silence as the rangers tried to process the macabre scene at the camp. After long discussions and with few options to dispose of the deer carcasses before they attracted predators, Peter, in a firm voice, proposed a practical solution: use the meat. Though the idea sparked murmurs of discomfort, most agreed. It was a cold decision, but a logical one. The forest had always demanded adaptation to the unexpected. The next few hours were filled with tense activity. The rangers divided tasks. Some prepared large bonfires, others skinned and cleaned the deer carcasses with almost mechanical precision. No one spoke more than necessary, and the crackling of the fire was the only soundtrack to this improvised ritual. Victor worked in silence, his hands moving skillfully but his mind far away, trapped in the echo of that voice that wouldn't stop resonating in his thoughts. By evening, the smell of roasting meat filled the air, replacing the stench of death that had permeated the camp that morning. The rangers gathered in a circle around the main fire, makeshift plates in hand. The discomfort lingered, but hunger and exhaustion were stronger. Despite everything, eating together restored some of the camaraderie the day had stolen. It was Peter who broke the silence. "I don't know about you, but this makes me think about how fragile we are out here," he said, gesturing to the darkness beyond the camp with a piece of meat in his hand. "The forest has always been our home, but it's also unpredictable. Something bigger is always lurking." There were murmurs of agreement. No one dared to mention what they truly felt, that what had happened wasn't a natural accident or mere coincidence. Something was watching them, something they didn't understand, and perhaps never would. Victor looked up from his plate, his eyes fixed on the flames. "The forest gives and takes," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've known that from the beginning, but sometimes we forget that we're not alone here. Maybe we shouldn't forget that we owe it respect." His words resonated with the group, though no one responded. The fire crackled, casting shadows that seemed larger than they should be, and the air, despite the heat of the flames, still felt strangely cold. That night, after eating, some tried to sleep while others kept watch. Victor, however, stayed awake, sitting in his chair by the dying fire. He watched the shadows, feeling that something was watching him from the thicket. "Thank you for taking care of the forest," he heard again in his mind, but this time the voice didn't feel like a whisper. It was a thought that didn't belong to him, but one he understood as a final warning. When dawn arrived, the deer were just a memory, but the forest remained as vast, as indifferent, and as alive as ever. Victor knew then that there was an unspoken pact between them and this place. The forest could be generous, but it also demanded reverence. And though he would never speak of it to anyone else, he accepted that truth as part of his existence. The rangers packed up the camp and returned to their routines, but something had changed in them. Every step on the ground, every glance into the shadows, carried a new respect and perhaps a little fear. The forest had spoken. Next story. My name is Mateo Oliveira, a Brazilian ranger who has dedicated the last 10 years of my life to protecting and preserving the Amazon rainforest. I know every corner of this vast territory, every ancient tree, and every creature that inhabits it. To me, there is no place more magical than this. But today, something peculiar happened during a guided excursion. The morning had started like any other, with a group of tourists ready to explore the dense vegetation. Among them was Samuel, a European man who seemed fascinated by the surroundings. From the very beginning, his eyes sparkled with a mix of admiration and an unsettling obsession. His awe was contagious, but at the same time, it made me uneasy. He kept stopping to touch the tree trunks, murmuring that they were masterpieces of nature. When we reached the clearing with the towering ceiba tree, I saw tears in his eyes. Nature? So pure, he said, and I felt a pang of concern in my chest. What had driven him to such a state? We finished the tour and returned to the camp. Although the rest of the group shared laughs and stories around the campfire, I could only think about Samuel and his strange connection to the forest. 2 days passed, and as I went about my daily tasks, an echo of unease lingered in my mind. Then one day, while checking the trails, I heard a familiar whisper. It was Samuel, but something was wrong. I found him at an improvised campsite, surrounded by leaves and branches, his face illuminated by the faint glow of torches he had lit with damp leaves. His gaze was intense, almost trance-like. "Mateo," he called to me in a trembling voice, "I found the essence of the forest." He was referring to a small altar he had built, adorned with wildflowers and stones. "Everything here is alive, every leaf, every breath. We must join this energy." Concern turned to alarm. It was clear that Samuel had crossed a line. His obsession had taken a dangerous turn. I tried to talk to him, but my words faded into the air. Samuel was trapped in a world of distorted perceptions. "You don't understand, Mateo. The forest has chosen me," he murmured, as if the forest were a conscious being. An impulse led me to try to guide him back to the camp, but he resisted. "I can't leave. This place is my home now," he told me with a voice full of deep longing. In a desperate attempt, I told him about the interactions the forest had with those who respected it, but he only smiled. Finally, I managed to carefully lead him back to the camp. The forest was beautiful, but the reality was that no one could get lost in it. From that day on, I watched Samuel, who continued to show an overwhelming love for nature, but also a dreamlike gleam in his eyes that told me the forest had claimed him in some way. Over time, I learned that the forest is a place of wonders and mysteries, but also of warnings. And though Samuel returned to the camp, a part of him remained irretrievably lost among the trees. I looked at Samuel with a mix of sadness and determination. The Amazon rainforest was my home, a universe where every leaf and every whisper told me a story, but in Samuel's case, the story had taken an unexpected turn. In the days that followed his return to the camp, the European man seemed more trapped than ever by the magic of those lands. His obsession with the beauty and grandeur of nature had consumed him, and Mateo knew he had to act. One afternoon, as they returned from a river tour, Mateo found Samuel lost in his thoughts again. "Why don't you go home? The forest isn't a place to abandon those who love you," he said, trying to sound as persuasive as possible. But Samuel kept staring at the horizon, where the trees stood like wise guardians. "Home? Mateo, this is where I truly belong. The forest has revealed its secrets to me. The connection is indescribable," Samuel replied, his eyes filled with a gleam Mateo could barely recognize. With care, Mateo tried to explain the importance of family and friends. He recalled how he himself had once felt the pull of the forest mystery, but it was a love that had to be shared with the outside world. "Don't you feel the sadness of those waiting for you? They worry about you," he insisted. Samuel frowned. "But here, the heartbeat of the earth is my heart. Every sound, every shadow, they're part of me. They don't understand this." They can't comprehend that the essence of life is in the forests, not in concrete. Mateo felt a knot in his stomach. The man before him had transformed. The forest hadn't just captivated him, it had begun to blur the boundaries of his own identity. Nature is amazing, but it can't replace human love, he said, his voice trembling. A heavy silence fell between them. Mateo looked at the ground, feeling the weight of helplessness. He tried again. Think of the stories your nieces and nephews will hear from you. Think about going home. The forest will always be here. Samuel turned to him, his gaze unwavering. Mateo, every time I breathe here, I feel like I'm becoming part of something greater. What if I can never feel that again? The ranger realized his words weren't reaching him, like echoes drowned out by the roar of the wind through the trees. Samuel's internal struggle was an abyss Mateo couldn't approach. Finally, he understood he couldn't drag him back. The forest had claimed a part of Samuel, while the man he had been slowly faded into a whisper among the leaves. I just want you to be safe, Mateo said, letting vulnerability show in his voice. Samuel smiled, but a flash of disdain crossed his face. Mateo, this is my home. And it always will be. With a heavy heart, Mateo retreated. He knew that, although he had brought Samuel back physically, a part of him would remain trapped in the forest, hidden among its charms and enigmas. The forest was pure, bewildering, and beautiful, and sometimes it could also be a place where souls were lost forever. The next morning, as the dew still glistened on the leaves, the sound of engines interrupted the serenity of dawn. Patrols. I approached the noise, curious and worried. My fellow rangers had alerted security forces after receiving news of a group of tourists in trouble. 3 days had passed since we ventured into the forest, and the other guides still hadn't returned. As I approached, I felt my heart race. There was something erratic in the newcomer's gaze. Mateo, they called, 2 tourists are missing. They've been gone since the day they arrived. My mind raced to Samuel. I saw them last, I replied in a hollow voice. They were part of my group. But Samuel, the words caught in my throat. Yet, my fear grew at the possibility that his obsession had led him to get even more lost. I decided to return to the camp, the murmur of the forest growing louder, and anxiety thickening like a heavy silence among the trees. I began searching his tent, my heart pounding. His backpack was there, unyielding and conspicuous. As I opened it, the air turned icy. Inside, among the hiking gear and ropes he was supposed to use to build a shelter, I found a small package wrapped in leaves. Trembling, I unwrapped it, and horror seized me. Inside was a collection of human teeth, yellowed and worn, mixed with dirt and leaves. My mind froze. What had Samuel done in his quest for the forest's secrets? A wave of alarm surged through me. I hadn't just lost him, he had crossed a point of no return. It was clear the forest had a price to pay. Gerardo, one of the rangers, appeared behind me, his face pale as he saw what I held. Mateo, my God, what is this? I tried to speak, but I couldn't. My thoughts were a whirlwind. I looked at the forest, the steadfast trees I once considered friends, and felt as though each one was watching, silent witnesses to Samuel's transformation. The echo of the engines faded, and the forest seemed to swallow the sound, leaving me alone with a series of anguished questions. As I stared at those teeth, the air was thick with tension as the rangers and security patrols ventured deeper into the forest. Mateo led the group, his mind torn between duty and the devastating suspicion weighing on his chest. Samuel had crossed a line, and the forest seemed to have embraced him or devoured him. They moved in silence, machetes cutting through the dense vegetation. The songs of birds and the crunch of branches underfoot seemed louder than ever. The group stopped occasionally, examining every footprint, every sign of recent activity. "Over here," shouted one of the rangers. Everyone rushed to a small clearing where the ground was marked by chaotic footprints and dark stains. Mateo crouched, touched the soil, and felt a chill run down his spine. Blood. Fresh. A deep roar echoed in the distance. It was the low, guttural sound of a jaguar, an unmistakable warning. "It's close," Gerardo whispered. The men exchanged fearful glances. It wasn't uncommon to encounter jaguars in the forest, but this roar was different. It wasn't a hunting call, but one of possession. They followed the trail cautiously, and soon the metallic smell of blood filled the air. Mateo raised a hand, stopping the group. Ahead, among the trees, a massive jaguar crouched, its golden and black fur glistening in the filtered light. Its jaws were red with blood, and at its feet lay Samuel's mangled body. The ranger swallowed hard as the jaguar lifted its head, its eyes gleaming with a mix of defiance and serenity. It was a predator in its element, claiming what, in some way, seemed rightfully its own. Mateo raised an arm, signaling the men not to shoot. "Don't provoke it," he said softly, his voice tight. The group slowly retreated, leaving the jaguar to finish its macabre feast. Mateo couldn't look away. Despite the horror of the scene, there was a terrible poetry to it. Samuel, who had proclaimed the forest as his home, had found his fate in its depths. The forest had claimed him in the most literal way possible. That night, as the team returned to the camp, the silence among the men was deafening. No one spoke of what they had seen. Mateo, however, couldn't forget. The image of Samuel, consumed by his obsession and ultimately by the jaguar, was etched into his memory. The forest had shown, once again, that it was beautiful, powerful, and merciless. From that day on, Mateo told Samuel's story to those who visited the forest, not as a warning, but as a reminder that the Amazon rainforest was a living, immense, and mysterious being. A place that could captivate the soul, but also devour it if its immense power wasn't respected. Next story. My name is Luca Korhonen. I'm Finnish, and I work as a ranger in one of the most remote national parks in Finland, near the Arctic Circle. Since I was a child, the vast expanses of snowy forests and endless skies have given me a sense of belonging and peace that I've never found anywhere else. I went from exploring these landscapes out of childish curiosity to protecting them with adult devotion. My job isn't just employment, it's a way of giving back to the natural world that has always embraced me. That night, after a long day of patrolling snow-covered trails and documenting elk tracks, I returned to my cabin, a modest refuge built of sturdy wood that creaked softly in the cold. I lit the fireplace, made a cup of hot tea, and allowed myself to relax. As the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, I went to the window, as I did every night, to gaze at the forest and the snow under the moonlight. That's when I saw it. There, among the tall, frost-covered pines, was a deer. It wasn't doing anything unusual, it was simply standing still, snow slowly accumulating on its back. But its eyes, those eyes seemed to pierce the darkness, locking onto mine through the glass. I felt a strange unease as I watched it. There was no fear in it, nor the usual wariness of a wild animal. It was as if it were waiting, as if its presence at that moment had a purpose I didn't yet understand. For a moment, I stood frozen, unable to look away. The forest, normally filled with small nighttime sounds, was completely silent, as if everything had come to a standstill. That solitary, spectral figure, bathed in moonlight and snow, seemed more like an apparition than an animal. What was it doing there? Why was it just staring at me? I decided to step away from the window. Surely, it was just an ordinary deer, nothing more. The forest is full of life, and it wouldn't be unusual for a curious animal to approach the cabin, drawn by the warmth or the smell of food. I returned to my chair by the fire, though the feeling of those eyes fixed on me didn't entirely fade. It was absurd. I've lived among deer and elk my entire life. There was no reason to feel uneasy. Yet, that night I closed the curtains before going to bed, something I rarely did. The next day, routine distracted me. I walked for hours through snowy trails, checking wildlife traps and noting changes in the environment. I even went to the frozen lake to check the ice thickness. But while I was there, something caught my attention, tracks in the snow that didn't seem to make sense. They were deer tracks, yes, but they appeared to go in circles, as if the animal didn't know where to go or was lost. I crouched to examine them. There was something strange about them, a detail I couldn't quite place. But I brushed off the unease, attributing it to fatigue. That night, as the forest silence settled over the cabin, I saw it again. It was there, in the same spot, motionless under the moonlight. This time, the cold seemed more intense, or perhaps it was the atmosphere. the same dark, inscrutable eyes fixed on me through the glass. I tried to ignore it, closed the curtains immediately, and focused on my tasks inside the cabin. I prepared my dinner, wrote some notes in my journal, tried to distract myself. But deep down, the deer's presence still weighed on me. The third night was different. The deer appeared again, but closer, almost at the edge of the small clearing in front of the cabin. When I went to close the curtains, its gaze trapped me. I froze for a moment, sensing that something about it had changed. Its antlers seemed larger, its eyes darker. It didn't move, but its stillness wasn't natural. It was unnatural, as if it were suspended in time. I yanked the curtains shut, locked the door, and tried to push it from my mind. But then I heard it. A low sound, almost imperceptible, like a whisper coming from somewhere outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind, but this sound had a rhythm, a strange cadence, as if someone were speaking words in a language I didn't understand. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours in bed, alert to every sound, every shadow moving outside. When dawn came, the deer was gone. I went out to the clearing, determined to find traces that would confirm it had all been real. But there was nothing. No tracks in the snow, no broken branches, not even a hint that something had been there. Yet deep down in it would return. And with each passing night, the feeling that something was changing, in the forest, in me, in the very air, became more palpable. The deer stopped appearing. Night after night, I peered out the window, expecting to see it, but the clearing remained empty, illuminated only by the moon and the reflection of ice on the snow. At first, I felt relieved, as if the oppressive atmosphere it had brought with it had dissipated. But as the days passed, that absence became unsettling. Had it all been my imagination? A trick of light and shadow, amplified by the solitude of winter? I tried to convince myself that was the case. However, the calm didn't bring peace. The forest began to feel different. I couldn't pinpoint a specific change, but there was something in the air, an invisible weight that seemed to follow me on my daily patrols. The birds, once active even in the coldest hours, were now silent. I found animal tracks that ended abruptly, as if their owners had vanished mid-step. And at night, though I knew I was alone, the feeling of being watched never left me. Then one night, it happened. It was late, and the full moon bathed the clearing in an unnatural light. I was finishing my notes from the day when a soft noise stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't a whisper, like before, but something more tangible, a crunch in the snow, a footstep. My heart began to race as I slowly approached the window. I carefully pulled back a corner of the curtains. There was. The deer had returned, but something was terribly wrong. It stood in the same spot where I had last seen it, but this time it was closer to the cabin, almost within reach of the light spilling from the windows. Its form seemed more robust, as if it had grown in my absence. But the worst part was its face. That was not the face of a deer. The animal's jaw was distorted, its lips stretched into a grotesque, unnatural grin that revealed teeth that didn't belong to any herbivore. They were human teeth. Its eyes, though dark as before, now had a gleam that seemed to laugh at me, mocking my attempts to ignore it on previous nights. I stood paralyzed, unable to look away, as if that grin had trapped me, forcing me to confront something I couldn't understand. Suddenly, it took a step forward, slow and deliberate, and then another. Its antlers, now so large they seemed to scrape the lower branches of the trees, looked twisted, like the roots of an ancient tree. I didn't know whether to move or stay still. Then I heard that sound again, that rhythmic whisper that seemed to emanate not from the forest, but from inside my head. "What do you want?" I murmured, not expecting an answer. But the deer's grin seemed to widen, as if my question had been the funniest joke in the world. And then it stopped. My body was rigid, caught between fear and disbelief. The deer remained motionless for what felt like hours, though surely it was only minutes. Then, without warning, something shifted. The air grew heavier, charged with a pressure I could almost touch, and the deer tilted its head slightly, as if assessing my reaction. And then what I feared most happened. With a sudden movement, the deer charged at the cabin door. The impact echoed like thunder in the night stillness. I jumped up, stumbling over the chair as I backed toward the fireplace. Another blow. The wooden door creaked but didn't break. I ran to secure it, pushing a heavy bookshelf against it, though deep down I knew it wouldn't be enough. The next charge was even fiercer, and this time the door gave a little. I could see the darkness outside, the deer's antlers moving like twisted shadows. The whisper returned, louder and clearer, enveloping me in a language I didn't understand but that seemed designed to invade my mind. Finally, with a final crash, the door burst open, letting the deer in. Or whatever it was. Its figure filled the doorway, larger than it should have been, and its humanoid face still bore that grotesque grin. The firelight illuminated its eyes, which didn't blink, fixed on mine. It didn't move toward me. It didn't growl or show signs of aggression. It simply walked slowly through the cabin, its hooves echoing on the wooden floor. Everything about its behavior suggested it wasn't an animal but something more, something conscious. It stopped in front of me, tilted its head as if studying every detail of my being, and again, that mocking grin widened. I couldn't move. The air was too thick, and my limbs wouldn't respond. The whisper filled the room, wrapping around me like an invisible shroud, until all I could feel was its presence. Then, as if time suddenly resumed, the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. The sun's rays touched the deer's figure, and in a blink, it was gone. There was no sound, no movement. It simply wasn't there anymore. The cabin was left in an overwhelming silence, the broken door hanging from its hinges and the cold air seeping through the entrance. I stood there, motionless, trying to process what had happened. When I finally gathered the strength to move, I went out to the clearing, searching for some sign that it had all been real. But, as before, there were no tracks, no marks, no trace at all. Just the forest, calm and indifferent under the dawn. I returned to the cabin and began repairing the door, my hands trembling as I worked. I knew that, though the deer had disappeared with the light, it wasn't truly gone. Something had crossed a boundary that night, something that had chosen me to witness it. And as I continued my work, I couldn't shake the image of that unnatural grin. A grin I knew I would never forget. At dawn, after reinforcing the door and ensuring the cabin could withstand future nights, Luca Korhonen made a decision. Though fear had left an indelible mark, he knew his place was there, in the heart of the forest. That land, with its relentless cold and silence heavy with mystery, was as much a part of him as he was of it. He could leave, seek refuge in the safety of civilization, but doing so would mean abandoning something deeper than a cabin. It would mean abandoning his purpose. As the days and weeks passed, the deer didn't return. But Luca never stopped feeling its presence, like a shadow lingering just out of reach, lurking among the trees. Yet, instead of succumbing to fear, he used that experience to strengthen his connection to the forest. In his journal, he recorded everything that had happened, trying to understand the meaning behind that encounter, searching for something he might never fully comprehend. Life in the forest continued, undisturbed. The seasons changed, and with them returned the songs of birds, fresh tracks in the snow, and elk wandering the trails. Luca returned to his routines, though now with a new perspective. He knew there were things in the natural world that defied logic, forces that existed beyond human understanding. But he also realized that this mystery was part of the forest's beauty and power. In one of his final journal entries, he wrote, "Sometimes, the forest shows us things we aren't ready to understand. Perhaps it's not to frighten us, but to remind us that we are small, that we don't know everything, that we don't control everything. My duty isn't to explain the mystery, but to protect the place where it lives." Luca Korhonen never left his cabin. The solitude of the Arctic remained his refuge, his home, and his responsibility. And though he never saw that creature again, its memory stayed with him as a constant reminder of the unknown, of what lies in the darkest corners of nature. Sometimes, the most important lesson isn't in understanding, but in learning to coexist with the mystery.